Good morning, welcome back. Delighted to have you all here today. Walking on the road to Emmaus, part seven already. Eight when you count Dan's outstanding talk that he did on heaven. So it's been great to be with you. Today, we're going to be talking about something which I find one of the most remarkable. It's really one of my favorite topics that we ever have an opportunity to share. Uh, Dan and I have been discussing this for decades, and it's something that I never can get enough of. It's the man in the shroud, and it's going to be looking at forensically the passion of Christ during his crucifixion, this Passion Week. Now, I always start end every class with a brick through a plate glass window, but I'm going to start because this whole class is a brick through a plate glass window. This is something that if this doesn't astound you, well then you can stone me afterwards because I don't think there's anything that I've ever read that is more provocative than what I'm going to share with you today. So I want to give you a warning though, right at the beginning. The following presentation contains some really disturbing graphic images that may be unsuitable for some. I know there have been times when there have been some children in here and I would have advised they not see this because this is some pretty graphic stuff. Dan and I always begin all of our sessions with the words of Martin Luther, sola scriptura, by scripture alone. We're going to put that to the test today because we're going to be talking about extra biblical evidence, but looking at it from a biblical perspective. So once again, that's going to be very important. And always trying to look at scripture as much as we can through Jewish eyes. We've discussed that time and again in here. Now, the Shroud of Turin is a great biblical mystery, but it's not a salvation issue. How many show of hands know what I'm talking about? The Shroud of Turin. You've heard about it? If you had a Roman Catholic background, that would be something you might have actually been instructed on. This is not necessary for Christian faith. If we find out that the shroud is an absolute fraud, it shouldn't affect our faith at all. But my contention is that since it's impossible to fully explain or replicate, if authentic, it's a strong and miraculous Christian witness. So I would look at it from the other extreme. My faith doesn't depend on this thing being something which is factual. But if it is, it's an amazing thing. Again, once again, proving the historicity of Christ and the divinity of Christ. This was Time magazine. Now, this was some decades ago, 1998. But it was a cover of Time, and it was talking about the shroud. At different times, periodically, there have been forensic studies of the shroud. This was one, but I just think it's a good way to begin. This is from the London Daily Sketch, which was a London newspaper from March of 1955, and it's the world's greatest picture? Question mark. Is that the face of Jesus? The Shroud of Turin. It's the most examined piece of forensic evidence in history. More than 150,000 man-hours of scientific research. This is the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, where it is housed, where the shroud has been housed for some centuries. That's what it would look like on display, pilgrims coming to venerate it. This is Pope John Paul II as he prayed before the shroud. The Catholic Church has never fully authenticated it, but they do have it as one of their icons, and they do venerate it, as you can see by the evidence here. The Shroud of Turin is 4.5 meters in length. It is little over 1 meter wide. The cloth is made of a herringbone weaved linen. It's a linen twill white shroud of the type that was produced in first century Palestine. The cloth was bleached in the fashion of the first century. It's a very well made and expensive piece of material, extremely rare today to even find anything like this. And it was used for a burial, typically of a wealthy individual. And I want to let that hang there. A wealthy individual. Note the burn marks from the fire, 1532. You can kind of see there's these little, they look like almost triangular, and there was an actual fire in 1532, and the casket that it was in, of metal, the metal started dripping on the cloth, and it actually caused these burn holes. The patches were actually woven by nuns to repair the burn marks back in the 16th century. And the appearance of 4 match burns or poker holes indicate that the cloth had been folded over twice. The image of a man, both obverse and reverse, who has suffered terrible wounds. He is Semitic in appearance with marked Jewish characteristics, including a forked beard and a pigtail. The man is 5 feet 11 inches tall. The weight is approximately 180 pounds. The body is totally nude. The hands are folded over the pelvis. And the man was well developed, and the image is absolutely anatomically correct. It is a dead body. Death was caused by asphyxiation. There's a clear distension of the abdomen, distended abdomen. Blood stains are found in numerous places on the cloth. The blood is human and is type AB. The man has been nailed through both wrists with 1 nail through both feet. There's a spear-type wound in the left side. A lance penetrated through the lung and into the heart and produced stains of both blood and water on the shroud. There are numerous abrasions and cuts on shoulders and knees. The knees suffered a bad fall on a hard surface. Evidence of a rough, heavy object was laid across the shoulders. There are 120 separate lash wounds, both front and back. Barbell-shaped wounds consistent with a Roman flagrum, the type of whippet the Romans used. We'll talk about that in a moment. The hands, the feet, and the chin are bound, and the legs are not broken. There are serious head lacerations. The face is severely beaten. One of the eyes is closed and blackened. The nose is twisted. Cartilage is separated from the bone. And the beard is torn. Blood flows and wounds indicate that the shroud was undoubtedly crucified. It is the image of a man who has endured terrible, grievous torture and suffered a horrible death. Let's look at the biblical account of Christ's crucifixion. Ecce homo, behold the man. The biblical evidence. This is from Matthew's gospel. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" This is consistent with Isaiah, his prophecy in chapter 50, verse 6. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed over to them to be crucified. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They spit on him and struck him on the head again and again. Then they led him away to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha, John's Gospel. Of course, on the way, Jesus a number of times suffered and fell down under the weight of the cross. He had been so severely beaten. Because of that, as the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and had him carry it behind Jesus. Now, it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers there, therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus, they found that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. These things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones would be broken. And as another scripture said, they will look on the one they have pierced. Now note the similarities to the man on the shroud between the gospel story and the man on the shroud. Scourged furiously, 40 lashes with a three-tailed whip. The Romans used a flagrum that had three tails to it, so 40 lashes would produce 120 wounds. We'll talk more about that later. Beaten about the face, the beard torn, a crown of thorns placed on the head, fallen down carrying a cross, crucified, a lance in the side, blood and water, and the legs not broken. And note the details of Christ's crucifixion that are unique, that we really don't ever see historically in any other. A crown of thorns, well, that's not something that the Romans would do. They did this because of the fact that Christ, they were crucifying him as the king of the Jews. They were mocking him, hence the crown of thorns. That was rare. Severe lashing and beating. Now, they would typically beat someone as a punishment, but to beat him terribly before putting him to death was kind of defeating the purpose. If you remember, Pilate was trying to get Jesus off. I know this sounds funny, but he really was. He was trying to get Jesus off, and he thought that the beating, the lashing, would be sufficient and he would let him go. But of course, it got out of hand, and the reason probably it did, historically, is the barbaric cruelty of the garrison in Judea and Palestine. Just a quick digression, we believe that the 10th Legion Fretensis was the legion in Palestine at the time that Jesus was crucified, and they were comprised mostly of Germans, of people that were actually getting their Roman citizenship by being in the army. You typically serve in the army for 20 years, and these Germans hated being sent to Palestine, to the Holy Land, to be on duty there, because it was so different from the forests and cool weather that they were used to. Plus, it was the only place in the Roman Empire where the people were always in revolt. Typically, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, worked for you as long as you paid your taxes and worshiped Caesar. Those were two things they didn't want to do in Palestine. The Jews did not worship Caesar, and they hated the idea of paying taxes to the Romans. And it was something that, again, the cruelty of the 10th Legion was legendary. So it's not hard to see that when the Romans took this guy that claimed to be king of the Jews, that they would really be venting their frustration and anger on him. The spear thrust in the side is something, again, unique, because what they would do, as we'll talk about later, is if they were going to hasten to death, they would break the legs. In this case, there were no broken legs of the man in the shroud, and neither would Jesus. The gospel accounts of the burial. Let's look at this. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that had been cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. Mark's Gospel. Another rendition, later Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with spice and strips of linen. This was in accordance with the Jewish burial customs. John's Gospel. And then from Luke, the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. So note the following. It was a very hasty burial. The body had to be interred before Passover began at Sabbath, at sundown. The body is unwashed, contrary to Jewish burial laws. That's why the women were going to come back the following Sunday, because they were going to finish the job. The head and beard were unshaven, contrary to rabbinic law. Finally, preparations were postponed to the next day, which we know as Easter Sunday. The body was not well cared for, yet Jesus was buried in a rich man's tomb in an expensive cloth, in Greek, anilesin, and that indicated an expensive cloth. Now examine the burial of the man on the shroud. The man is also not well cared for. He is also unwashed and unshaven. Yet he is also buried in a very expensive linen cloth. Now the Essenes were a group, for those who've been to the Holy Land, if you've been to Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, that group was the Essenes. And they actually had very strict standards for burial. Among them, the hands always had to be crossed over the pelvis with the elbows protruding. The hands and the feet had to be tied with strips of linen. The code of Jewish law of mourning stated that, quote, a man executed by the government was to be buried in a single sheet. And finally, a long linen cloth was folded over the entire length of the body. This gives you an idea of what it would have looked like. Now, it may be hard from where you're sitting, but you can see the bottom part is a obverse side, and then there's a reverse side, as if the man had been laid and it had been folded over. In other words, having images on both sides, just one sheet folded over. Now, we have a little bit of a Greek and Hebrew semantics problem with these gospel accounts. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell how Jesus was buried in a single expensive linen sheet, anilesin in the Greek. The burial shroud was also called a syndone. John's gospel, though, appears to contradict the synoptics, stating that Jesus was buried in linen strips, adessim, strips of linen. John also mentions the face cloth used in Jewish burial called a sudarium. Talk about that in a moment. Finally, John speaks of plural cloths, athonia, cloths instead of a single cloth. Well, Jesus was not buried in long strips of linen bound like an Egyptian mummy. Okay, you remember the pictures of the mummy. It was not like that. The Jews didn't do that. The Jews buried the dead in a single shroud. The linen strips that John refers to are those that bound the hands, feet, and chin of the deceased to help offset the effects of rigor mortis. You might remember Jacob Marley in A Christmas Carol, how he's got the thing wrapped around his mouth. That's what they would do to keep everything together from rigor mortis. The Jewish Mishnah, Shabbat 23, actually instructs the Jews to tie up the chin for burial. It's something they did. The man on the shroud is tied about the head. The image actually is indicating that it's tied about the head. The sudarian was a separate face cloth used along with the shroud. You'd have a burial shroud, but then over the face there would be a napkin, if you would, just a small sheet on top of the face. You give an idea here how it would have been enacted. So is it a forgery or a genuine burial cloth? Well, the image is a light scorch. It's a light scorch. It's actually saccharides that have been browned. The image does not penetrate below the surface layer of fibers. It's just on the top layers. It is not paint, pigment, stain, acid, dye, or any applied material. Ironically, the blood and serum, which is human type AB, seep and soak all the way through the cloth. The blood is on the cloth first. First the blood, then the image. The scorching appears only on the surface threads, whereas the blood penetrates the cloth completely. For more than 3 centuries, the shroud had quietly remained in Turin, Italy. And then a remarkable thing happened. This is from the Shroud exhibition of 1898. As I said, periodically, the Catholic Church would allow it to be put on display. And in 1898, they had a big festival, if you would, maybe not festival, but an exhibition where they were allowed to see it. This is what it would have looked like inside the church. This is actually a poster from the 1898 exhibition, and this is actually a commemorative medal that they would hand out to pilgrims, probably some kind of penance thing, I don't know, maybe the Catholic Church, it might have been to get you out of purgatory or something, I don't know. But the deal was there's a lot of attestation to it. Now this is a man by the name of Secondo Pia, and he made the first photograph ever of the shroud, the first photograph. This is what the shroud looks like to the naked eye upon a close-up. He then took a photograph, and this is what emerged. The shroud is a negative image. When he took the picture, the negative that he was developing was a photograph. It stunned him so much, he said he almost dropped the glass plate. He couldn't believe it. Take a look at the difference here. On the left is the shroud as we would see it through the naked eye, and on the right is how it looks it's a double negative, which means it's then a photograph. Let that sink in. Isn't that amazing? Look at the detail. What forger would know that? This was later another photograph in 1931, the Henry photo, which is actually a little bit better example. Compare the two again. This would be the entire shroud as it would look to the naked eye, and this is the way it would look as a photographic negative, which then makes it a positive. It's a double negative. We're making sense with that. It's astonishing, astonishing difference. Now, in 1988, the Catholic Church allowed there to be a carbon-14 dating. And there were 3 different laboratories, one in Oxford, one in Zurich, and one in Tucson, Arizona. 1988. All 3 came up with the same conclusion. Now look at these 3 guys. These are the 3 scientists from the various places, and they're just enjoying this immensely. Because not only do they say it was a forgery from the 13th to 14th century, but they put an exclamation point behind it. I think the guy in the middle is really, really enjoying the fact that they've, completely trashed the shroud. So this was something was big news in 1988. It was a forgery. There was even one scholar, and I use scholar with quotes around it, that said Leonardo da Vinci actually created the shroud, and that the man in the shroud is actually his own face. You can see how close it comes to da Vinci's self-portrait. Well, I think we can get rid of that one quickly because Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452 and died in 1519. Yet the shroud was put on display in Liry, France in 1355. So good trick, Leonardo. I don't know how you pulled that one off. That's the kind of stuff. This is actually an emblem that was handed out, a metal piece from that 1355 exhibition, proving that it really was. And you can kind of see in the middle the man in the shroud. So there was also damage control, which I think is rather amazing too. In 1532, there was a fire. And what happened is there were actually holes that were in the shroud itself, but it did not damage anything as the image itself. It was all around the image. And I think that's pretty remarkable, that the fact is that not a single part of the image itself was touched by the fire. They rescued it just in time. In 1997, the same thing happened again. Come on, Catholics, let's be a little more careful here. But they saved from fire again. And once again, there was no damage to the shroud. But what it did do, possibly, you be the judge, is contaminated the fibers of the shroud, because the fire would have caused some of the various fibers to be contaminated. This is from a guy by the name of Dr. Alan Adler, who was a biochemist and member of the Shroud Conservation Commission, and he analyzed 15 fibers extracted from the shroud sample used for the carbon dating, the sample that was given to the three laboratories. After comparing with 19 fibers from various other areas of the shroud, Adler found such a high degree of pollution on the sample used for radiocarbon dating that he concluded it is not representative of the entire shroud. It actually shows where the different samples came from. This is Dr. Raymond Rogers of the Los Alamos lab, and he was a leading expert on thermal analysis. And he noticed that there was actual reweaving that was done, and he was able to separate the medieval reweaving from the original weaving of the shroud itself. This was his conclusion. The radiocarbon dating was accurate. But because the samples were from cloth that was not part of the original shroud, they are irrelevant regarding the age of the image area. What about forensic evidence? The body is completely naked and probably did not wear a loincloth. It's consistent with a Roman method of crucifixion. A forger would need to have known this. This is what a Jewish burial custom in the shroud would have looked like. It gets a haunting picture right there. Needless to say. Now, the illustration shows the angle of the arms at crucifixion as deduced from the shroud by determining the path of the blood flows following the course of gravity. So they were able to look at the blood flows of the man of the shroud and be able to ascertain where his arms would have been to cause the path of the blood. The main angle appears to have been 65 degrees, but there is evidence that at some stages the forearms were at 55 degrees, indicating that the man of the shroud sought to raise himself, probably continually during crucifixion. Pretty good trick for a forger. Another amazing discovery, you be the judge. In January 2019, a new investigation concluded that the man of the shroud's right arm appeared to be 6 centimeters longer than the left one. Scholars attributed this apparent anomaly to a fracture in the elbow or a dislocation in the shoulder, which is compatible with a crucifixion. They also took into account that the arms would have had to be forcibly bent to overcome the stiffness of the body at the time of burial, again because of rigor mortis. Yet more. There's a loose pigtail on the man in the shroud, and that's a first century Jewish tradition. You don't often see that in movies, but that is apparently what they would have done, and it's rarely portrayed in art today. A forger would have had to know that in the 14th century. The head lacerations of the man in the shroud. Not a crown of thorns, and again, I want to warn you on this picture, they're horrible. Not a crown of thorns, but literally a bonnet of thorns. How horrible that is. You can't imagine the Roman soldiers taking time to weave a crown like you see in some of the medieval art, but they would have just taken and just crushed it down upon his head. What about the scourging? Brutal beating, 120 separate wounds. There's 120 separate wounds of the man in the shroud. The story of Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross is very unusual. Jesus was so severely beaten that he could not continue. You have to remember, the other 2 men that were crucified with him, nobody carried their crosses. They weren't beaten like that. They were just taken out to be crucified. The scourging. Scourging was applied by 2 men, one taller than the other. The way they figured this out is the lash wounds overlapped left and right, back and forth. Left and right, back and forth. They could tell that there were 2 different men that did the scourging of the man in the shroud. This is a Roman flagrum. And what it would be is a whip that would have 3 thongs on it, and they would put bits of metal or little dumbbell, barbell-shaped metal that would tear the flesh. They called it the half-death. The half-death. The Sanhedrin imposed 40 lashes. That was their penalty, was 40 lashes. Well, 40 lashes with a whip that had 3 thongs on it, you get the idea, 120 separate wounds. And that's exactly the number on the man on the shroud. 3 tails per whip, 40 lashes. Who would have known that? This horrible picture is actually what the blood marks look like from the lash marks of the man on the shroud. Now, whether this is authentic or not, Christ did endure this. That, I think, is the most amazing thing. If nothing else today, just what Christ endured. The scourge marks are somewhat disfigured on the shoulders, indicating, get this, that something heavy and rough had later been carried on the shoulders over the lash wounds. I wonder what that was. Nailing through the hands. Well, here's more forensic proof. Nailed through the hands and the feet. Always depicted by artists as being nailed through the palms. Always. Here's Velázquez. Christ nailed through the palms. Rubens. Titian. Doré. Rembrandt. Michelangelo. El Greco. Dali. Everyone, every painter always has Jesus nailed through the hands. And yet the man in the shroud is nailed through the wrists. Now we know forensically, and the actual Greek word is kairos, which is translated hands, nailed through the hands, kairos. But you can see the man in the shroud, the image, is actually the mark is through the wrist itself. Now, we know forensically that you could not nail someone to a cross through the hands would just tear. So what the Romans would do is they would nail it through the bones of the wrist. Again, some forger had to know that in the 14th, 15th century, whatever it was, 13th century. This is what it would have looked like. This is the way it would have been nailed through the wrist. Again, horrible thing to see, but that's what it was. And the man in the shroud is nailed through the wrist, not through the hands. So the forger would have had to know anatomically that that was the only way that the Romans could have done it. Well, kairos in Greek, believe it or not, is a word meaning hand or wrist. The Greek word actually means hand or wrist. It's just that in the English translation, it's always through the hand. So that's what we always think, that Jesus was crucified through the hands. What medieval forger would have known that? The feet of the man on the shroud. The feet. This is the image of the feet. Crucified through the heel. That's actually a bone of a man that was crucified that was found. And there's actually a Roman nail. This is something that was found just archaeologically of what a Roman nail would have looked like through a heel bone. And that's, you can see this is where what they would do is they would take the feet overlapping them, and one nail would have nailed the feet to the cross, one on top of the other. This is a dorsal view of the feet of the man in the shroud with the blood marks. It's a direct, now get this, a direct sample was taken from the image of the feet, and it proved to be a rare type of calcium carbonate found in Jerusalem. Actual dirt on the feet on the image of the man in the shroud was a calcium carbonate found in Jerusalem. And then there's the crurifragium. Now, it was the day, I won't read all of this, but you know the story. It was the day of preparation, and of course they had to hurry up and get the bodies down, and what they did is they broke the feet, broke the legs of the 2 men that were crucified with Jesus, but with him, they found he was dead, so they didn't do that. That was called the crurifragium. What the Romans would do, and they thought this was something which was actually humane, is they would break the legs, and that would cause the man to die quickly. Because what a crucified body he would die of asphyxiation. He'd be trying to hoist himself on his legs to get breaths, because his lungs would fill up with water. and eventually he would die of asphyxiation. So you'd have to keep hoisting yourself, which is why the man in the shroud having the different images of the blood flows would be a man that was continually trying to hoist himself to breathe. But if they broke the legs, they would die quickly. And this is something, Ken, that they did with the two thieves, but they did not do with Jesus. Pierced with a spear. Again, we read about that already, that Jesus was pierced with a spear. That was something which was unique because that was something that they never did. But they just wanted to make sure that there was no life, that they thought he was dead, but rather than break his legs, they pierced him with a spear. Well, of course, that was the fulfillment of prophecy, that they will look on the one they have pierced. This is what the actual entrance of the spear would have looked like on the man in the shroud. This is what's called the spear of destiny. As a quick aside, when Adolf Hitler had the Anschluss in Austria and actually combined Austria into the German Reich, one of the first things he did is he sent the Gestapo to a museum in Vienna, a royal museum in Vienna, that had what they called the Spear of Longinus. There was a tradition that Longinus was the Roman soldier that stuck the spear in the side of Jesus. And this is reputedly the spear. Again, you'd be the judge, but this was traditionally the spear. And the idea was, it was said that whoever possessed the spear would own the world, would conquer the world. Hitler apparently believed that because he wanted to make sure that they got the spear and brought it to Berlin. But that still exists to this day, the Spear of Destiny. The image is three-dimensional. It's what's called a bump map. A bump map. Three-dimensional image. This is why, when the shroud is laid over the body, there are parts where it touches the body and parts where it doesn't, where there's gaps. So the image then actually appears to be three-dimensional because of the way that the shroud laid. Can you kind of see that? How there's spaces at different parts where we just lay on top of it? Now, it has some very interesting X-ray properties as well. While studying the image on the Henry photograph of Professor Alan Wenger observed that the face and the sinus were visible and also part of the teeth. In the image of the hands, the, I guess, metacarpalia are visible like on an X-ray photograph. It seems that part of the energy that caused the image had long wavelengths of X-ray properties. What about the owlish staring eyes? Those owlish staring eyes on the man in the shroud. Well, there's a reason for that too. Ancient burial practice, what the Jews would do, and in many societies even do to this day, is they would place coins on the eyes of the deceased. They did that with Lincoln when Lincoln died. They placed coins on his eyes. Again, this is, what's that? I'm sorry.
Was it a Lincoln penny?
It certainly was the first one. This is, again, this kind of owlish looking eyes. Well, interestingly enough, these are leptons. Leptons, Pontius Pilate coins from 30 AD. And you guessed it, under a microscopic analysis, it's leptons. Pontius Pilate coins that are on the eyes of the man in the shroud. I'll let that sink in there. You can get an idea. Those are the different.
But aren't they supposed to be for paying the entity that takes you over the river Styx?
Well, that's what the Romans would do. The Greeks, yeah. Good call, Jan. That's what they would originally. But the idea was that they would do this too, to just kind of. The Jews certainly didn't do that because they didn't believe in that. But it was just a tradition that they had. What about the blood? This is under a, again, another photo. This is how much blood is literally on the shroud. It's all blood. All the red is blood. It's, as I said, type AB human blood. AB blood plasma. This is interesting. You be the judge. The plasma from AB blood is considered special. Only 4% of blood types is AB, but its plasma is significant in saving all lives. As the universal plasma, it can be transferred to all patients regardless of their blood type. It is sometimes referred to as liquid gold because of its value. AB blood means its plasma can be used in helping any patient in need. I thought about this. The Red Cross states, in times of emergency, when there is no time to type and cross-match blood to determine an emergency patient's blood type, universal AB positive and negative plasma can be used to help save that person's life, unquote. Think about this. The universality of type AB blood plasma certainly correlates with the universal redemption provided in the atoning blood of Christ Jesus. How amazing that the man in the shroud has AB. Do we have any AB in here? Anybody have AB? We do? Wow, wonderful. You're a gold standard, buddy. I'm going to take care of you. I want you to be my friend. So once again, look at the man in the shroud, the regular image, and then what's like under a photographic negative. Now this is really amazing. The second phase. In 2004, Professor Julio Fanti and Roberto Maggiolo of the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Padua in Italy reported the discovery of, get this, a second face on the backside of the shroud. This indicates that the shroud was not created by paint soaking through the linen or by photographic image printing through to the reverse side, because the front and back facial images are not identical, and they enter fibers show no image creation whatsoever. The scientists found the faint image of the face on the reverse side of the shroud contained the same 3D information contained in the face and body image of the crucified man seen on the shroud's front side. There are 58 separate plant pollens that were found on the shroud. Evidence of 58 different types of pollens. 45 were from the Jerusalem area and were appropriate with the spring in Israel. When is Passover? When was the crucifixion? In the spring. Passover, the time of the crucifixion, is in the Jewish month of Nisan, or late March or early April. The spring in Israel. 6 pollens were from the eastern Middle East, with 2 found in Edessa, Turkey, and 1 pollen species growing exclusively in Constantinople. The balance were native to Greece, France, and Italy. The pollens overlap each other in the order shown above, from Jerusalem to Italy. So the oldest pollens, the earliest layer of pollens is from Jerusalem, and then the later ones progressively until finally the ones in Italy. And of course, where's the shroud been for the last? In Italy. It's amazing. And we don't do this today because we don't have the time, but our second half, when Dan and I do this talk, is the actual historicity of where the shroud may have originated. And yes, it starts from Armenia, Edessa, goes progressively through Constantinople, through Greece, through France, and through Italy. And again, it's amazing how the pollens work the same way. This is amazing. I don't even know what to make of this. You be the judge. Floral images. Floral images. Professor Dannon, botanist and professor emeritus of the Department of Evolution, Systematics and Ecology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, confirmed a remarkable finding under ultraviolet photographic examination. The image of hundreds of individual flowers from more than 5 different species found on the shroud. All are from Israel and bloom in March and April. This is what he wrote. 4 plant species, the images of which are found on the shroud, indicate the geographical origin of the shroud. Fresh stems of plants, and I won't read all of these Latin names, but you can see them up there, are placed on the dead man's body only in a strip of land a few kilometers wide from Jerusalem and Hebron, where they would have originated. 9 blooming species found on good photographs of the shroud share blooming months of March and April, thus indicating that the event of covering the man with the plants in the shroud took place during that time of the year. Isn't that amazing? Thorn images. Dr. Dannon also detected the images of at least 9 thorns. He suspects that they belong to a plant. I won't read the Latin. It's both considered to be among the most ferocious plants in Israel. This is what it looked like. Imagine that. This again is also something amazing. There is also images of writing, like different things that apparently had come apart, but like it looks like some kind of a Roman writing that was literally buried with the man on the shroud. And Vatican researcher Barbara Frail actually found the different words. There's Jesus, Jesus, actually on the shroud, Nazarene, taken down to death, and I execute. Now these things may have come apart in some fashion, but it's almost like there was a sign that was buried with the man on the shroud. This is interesting too. It would have been regarded as blasphemous to refer to the Lord Jesus as the Nazarene in medieval times. So this was a forgery. Somebody actually came up with this as an idea. To call Jesus the Nazarene would have not been done in medieval times. This is a brick through a plate glass window, the Siderium of Oviedo, Spain. Remember I said that the Siderium is a cloth that they would place over the face. This is blood-stained cloth which was placed over a dead man's face. It was folded over so as to produce a fourfold stain. The man that wore it died upright, and nasal fluids consistent with pleural edema from asphyxiation suffered by a crucified man. It also is blood type human AB. This is the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, Spain. This is the actual crypt that it is kept in. This is Dr. Mark Goosen, who demonstrates the placement of the Siderium over a man's face. This is the way it would have been placed over the dead man's face. This is what it looks like, the Siderium. Now, the Siderium of Oviedo, in 570 AD, Antoninus of Piacenza wrote about the face cloth of Jesus being kept in a cave near Jerusalem. In 614 AD, it was taken from Palestine to avoid capture by the Persian invaders. In 616 AD, it was carried across North Africa to Christian Spain. 616 AD. In 840 AD, it was housed in a small chapel built by King Alfonso II of Asturias near Oviedo. In 1075, King Alfonso IV and El Cid actually examined the Siderium. In 1113 AD, the Siderium was placed in a silver chest and has been housed permanently in the Cathedral of Oviedo ever since. 1113 AD. It has remained there ever since. Now let's compare the Siderium of Spain with the shroud in Turin, Italy. Both cloths are stained with human type AB blood. Identical pollens were found on both cloths. The placement of the blood stains of both cloths match perfectly. Both cloths unquestionably touch the same face. A perfect match. A provocative new study claims the figure on the Shroud of Turin shows, get this, movement. Movement. This is from 2018. Italian researchers claimed that the image of the shroud depicts movement. It is believed that the body image is a slight oscillation and as such suggests the very moment of Christ's resurrection. Like it was a burst of movement at the moment of resurrection. Wow, wow, wow. What furniture could do this? The apparent discovery was made by Giuseppe Maria Catalano. Wish they were British instead of Italians, right? There's just these names. Of the International Institute of Advanced Studies of Space Representation Science in Palermo, Italy. Excuse me. Catalano claims to have used in, pardon me? Somebody say something? No. Okay. Catalano claimed to have used an old technique called photogrammetry, the science of making distance measurements of surface depicted on photographs to recreate what may have been happening if and when the image was created from a human body. He believes that the hands were actually moving, oscillating at the moment the image was created. If true, was this an involuntary movement by a recently dead, deceased corpse, or a physical sign made at the moment of Jesus' resurrection? You be the judge. Recently, scholars have detected a further baffling mystery regarding the seeming hand movement of the man of the shroud. This is amazing. The hand position described on the shroud resembles that found on the 6th century Byzantine icon known as Christ Pantocrator, Christ the Almighty, of St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, Egypt, which is an ancient gesture of blessing. This is Christ Pantocrator. These are everywhere. The Christ Pantocrator images are all over the world. This is the Orthodox Church. And this is what the hand looks like. This is an ancient Orthodox blessing, an ancient Christian blessing. The man on the shroud has the same fingers. Could it be at the moment of resurrection that the fingers were in the symbolic blessing position? The Christ Pantocrator. In a rare special television appearance of the shroud, introduced by Pope Francis I, it was announced that the new test indicated that the Shroud of Turin dates to the time of Christ. This is from 2013. This is from The Guardian from 2013. The program comes amid new claims that the piece of fabric, which many Catholics believe Jesus was buried in, does indeed date from around his lifetime. Previous tests apparently confirmed the shroud to be a clever medieval forgery. Julio Ponti, associate professor of mechanical and thermal measurement at Padua University, claims tests had shown that the cloth which bears the image of a man's face and body dates from between 280 BC and 220 AD. Well, what produced the image? Was it a miraculous ionization at the moment of the resurrection of Jesus? Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro of Italy, in the National Agency for New Technologies, Energy, and Sustainable Economic Development, and NIA, conducted 5 years of experiments using state-of-the-art lasers to train short bursts of ultraviolet light on raw linen in an effort to simulate the image. Let that sink in there. For 5 years, he was using lasers, light, to try to simulate the image. This is astonishing. NIA published its findings in 2011. They were unable to match the physical and chemical characteristics of the shroud image. The team concluded that the ultraviolet light necessary to do so exceeds the maximum power released by all ultraviolet light sources available today. Dr. De Lazaro suggested that it would require pulses having a duration shorter than 1/40 billionth of a second, and intensities on the order of several billion watts. The entire burst of energy at the very moment of the Lord's resurrection. Wow. Wow. Atheist Dr. John Heller, a member of the 1978 Shroud research team, was on ABC's 2020. This is back in 1981. He said the chances of the Shroud being a fake are 1 in 10 million. Dr. Heller is now a Christian. So here's a coroner's report. I'm going to close with this. This is an amazing thing. You be the judge. I'll try to read this with my eyes, but you'll get the idea. And this is something which is very difficult to read, not just because of my vision, but because of what I'm going to be sharing with you. Let this sink in, because regardless of what the man of the shroud is, this is what Jesus endured. Dr. Robert Buckland, MD, the former deputy coroner of Los Angeles and a member of the Shroud of Turin research team, compiled the following pathological report concerning the shroud. There's no problem in diagnosing what happened to this individual. The pathology and physiology are unquestionable and represent medical knowledge unknown 150 years ago. This is a 5'11" male, Caucasian, weighing about 178 pounds. The lesions are as following. Beginning at the head, there are blood flows from numerous puncture wounds on the top and back of the scalp and forehead. The man has been beaten about the face. There is swelling over one cheek, and he undoubtedly has a black eye. His nose is abraded, as would occur from a fall, and it appears that the nasal cartilage may have separated from the bone. There is a wound in the left wrist, the right one being covered by the left hand. This is the typical lesion of a crucifixion. There is a stream of blood down both arms. Here and there are blood drips at an angle from the main blood flow in response to gravity. These angles represent the only ones that can occur from the only two positions which can be taken by a body during crucifixion. On the back and front, there are lesions which appear to be scourge marks. The victim was whipped from both sides by two men, one of whom was taller than the other, and demonstrated by the angle of the thorns. There is a rough swelling of both shoulders with abrasions indicating that something heavy and rough had been carried across the man's shoulders within hours of death. On the right flank, a long, narrow blade of some type entered in upward direction, piercing the diaphragm, penetrating the thoracic cavity, and through the lungs into the heart. This was a post-mortem event. It happened after the man was already dead. Because separate components of red blood cells and creatine and clear serum drained from the lesion. Later, after the corpse was laid out horizontally and face up on the cloth, blood dribbled out of the side wounds and puddled along the small of the back. There is an abrasion of one knee commensurate with a fall, and finally a spike had been driven through both feet, and blood had leaked from both wounds onto the cloth. The evidence of a scourged man who was crucified and died from cardiopulmonary failure, typical of crucifixion, is clear-cut. Dr. Robert Buckland concluded, from this data, it is not unreasonable conclusion for the forensic pathologist to determine that only one person in history has undergone this sequence of events. That person is Jesus Christ. So the shroud cannot be duplicated today. It cannot be duplicated. Nobody can figure out how anybody could have created this. Three-dimensional. Can this truly be Christ's burial cloth? What is your verdict? Is this the face of Jesus? You be the judge. So, as we traveled on the road to Emmaus, I thought this was a brick through a plate glass window. We wanted to share this with you. It is something that I don't think Jesus discussed with the disciples, but it's something that he, if that is the shroud, his burial shroud, it's something that he actually experienced shortly before that actual trip that he took with those two disciples, because that was Easter Sunday morning. And I don't know about you folks, but I'm personally convinced of the authenticity. I don't know how anybody can walk away with that without thinking that's the most amazing piece of evidence that exists anywhere today. So you be the judge. Next week, we've got a special guest speaker, Dale Hoffaker. I don't know how many of you know Dale. He's a good friend of Dan and mine. We've gone to Israel together. And those of you that have gone to Israel with us will remember Dale. He's an actual, I hate to use the word expert specialist because, that's such an arbitrary thing. But if there's an expert on the Nephilim and on demons, Dale's the guy. We were in the Navy together 40 years ago, and I've known him ever since. He's a remarkable scholar, and I think you'll find it of great interest. There's something going on in the world today. In fact, how many of you know Jonathan Cahn's work? Jonathan Cahn, if not, you should. It's a remarkable scholar, a Messianic Jew. He's written a number of best-selling books. And he's got a book recently out called The Return of the Gods, excuse me, which he postulates that throughout all of history, a lot of the civilizations in the world have had ancient deities, evil gods, if you would, that are similar all over the world. They all would have had blood sacrifice, but it was human blood, the kinds of things we talked about last week, in the class last week. And he postulates that these demons, these spirit demons, are actually working overtime in the world today. We could be in the last days. So it's something I think you'll find of great interest. I'm not sure what the time is because they took our clock down off the wall. So how are we doing for time? Okay. How many? Do we have any time left at all? Or does anybody have anything they'd like to share or any comments? Jan?
A couple of other authors, Derek Gilbert did